We'll start with the question from Kyle Gershwind from his polling question. This one's interesting. So I think it'll give us a little bit of a chance to talk about our philosophy on polls and how we cover polls and so forth. But Kyle asks, how confident should we be in the reliability of opinion polling on guns, i.e. for assault weapons bans, universal background checks, etc.? For instance, when Americans are asked if they want stricter / the same / looser gun laws, is there any point of reference for how strict the laws currently are? And he's got a number of similar points on that front. When people are asked if they want to ban AR-15s, are they given any additional information on how popular the guns are or how feasible the policy is? And so it's just sort of a general question here on polling. How reliable should we take it to be? How should we look at, public policy polling around guns? And I think this is a good question. Jake, why don't you give it? I want to hear your take first.
Sure. Yeah. So, we've kind of talked whenever we do a news update or whatnot on a particular poll, the typical disclaimers apply that, polling isn't an exact science. Any one particular poll isn't gospel necessarily. But what polling is good for is it generally gives you a good indication of a trend. So if you can maybe see a couple different polls, and if they're all noting something similar, maybe directionally the same, if you're seeing multiple polls from multiple pollsters with a decline in support for gun control, for example, then you can use that to say, oh, maybe something is going on here. But in terms of, any one particular poll saying, 54% of Americans support X policy, that doesn't necessarily mean that, it's an exact 54% concrete number of people that support that policy. And in terms of his question about whether or not people are given context, typically not. That's usually considered priming your polling respondents. So it's usually just a fresh question that they're asked. So they're not necessarily given a whole bunch of context or background before they ask, hey, do you support this policy? Because then that might skew the accuracy of a given poll.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at polling, I think a lot of your points there are very salient. It's not an exact science. You're not going to get perfect results every time. You're not going to be able to take a couple point shift one direction or another as an absolute hard truth. And there are issues, I think, when you're examining polls about how they ask the questions, right? That's a significant issue. I mean, I think base level, right, there's an important distinction to make too between scientific polling and your sort of unscientific polling. This is like a Drudge poll or a poll on a website or a Twitter poll or something. Those are not scientific polls. They don't have the necessary techniques to give you a more reliable answer. They don't have things like randomization. They're often polls that are only being answered by people who are seeking out the poll to answer it, which is a problem. You also have representation. Is the sample representative of the people you're trying to get information from? That's another problem with this sort of informal polling, is that it's basically completely unreliable. But that's why the major polling firms, Quinnipiac, Pew, Gallup, Fox, CBS, all these, the major polling firms have at least some of those basic safeguards in place to give you some level of reliability that you're not going to get from just your Facebook poll that you put up, right? And so that's I think the first important thing to note about polling is like there's very different levels of reliability among polls. And before you talk about any poll, I think it's important that it has at least those basic safeguards of a randomized sample of that's representative of the people you're trying to you're trying to get the opinion of, and that the wording is done in a way that's at least somewhat neutral. There's always going to be difficulty in getting to the perfect question because some of the issues here that Kyle brings up on, for instance, banning AR-15s or assault weapons or whatever. If you don't offer the definition for what an assault weapon is, or people don't have a conception for how popular AR-15s are, or how realistic the idea of trying to confiscate them is. The poll is going to come out all kinds of different ways. And but at the same time, if you ask someone, do you want to ban the AR-15, which, by the way, is this great, awesome, popular gun, and no one would give them up anyway? Like, that's also not a fair way to phrase a question. So there is a lot of ambiguity that goes into it, and a lot of skill really that's required to get answers that are actually useful. And frankly, we're working with, most of the time, very imperfect polling in that regard. But it can still be useful, I think. Because, a lot of times it's all you've got.
Right.
We don't have the funds to, conduct our own polling. It's very expensive, generally speaking, to do. But you kind of have to work around those limitations, try and point them out to the reader if possible, be upfront with people about what was specifically asked about, and why the results matter. And you will get a lot of times, even in a perfect poll, a poll that's done really well, you'll get answers that are contradictory. Like, public opinion is not necessarily consistent on any issue. This is another point that Kyle brings up. Like, you're going to get results that seem to contradict themselves, or especially like if you're looking at them from a particular ideological point of view, they might seem to contradict themselves in your mind, right? Like, for instance, you'll often find in polling, especially, we've done a lot of pieces on the recent polling in Texas on the race between Beto O'Rourke and Greg Abbott. And you'll find there that Texans want stricter gun laws, right? But they also want teachers to be armed. They don't like Beto O'Rourke, and they put Greg Abbott well ahead of him, but they support, there's a majority support for a mandatory buyback of AR-15s and other guns, at least in one poll. Now, another poll shows that a ban on assault weapons there's majority opposition to that in Texas. So, now these are not hugely divergent results. It's not like one poll found 90% of people were for confiscation. The other poll found 90% were against the ban. It was like 50 is in the 50-50 range for both of those polls. But still, you're going to have variation from poll to poll. You're going to have slight differences in the way that you ask a question. What does banning assault weapons mean? What is a mandatory buyback? I think to a lot of people who don't understand what that policy is, the idea of a buyback sounds like something that isn't necessarily mandatory. And so, even though they do describe it as mandatory buyback, I think a lot of people might be confused as to what exactly that means. Like, that sounds like you go somewhere and sell your gun to somebody. But in reality, it's just confiscation because you don't have an option. And people who refuse to do it will be, prosecuted. That's what Beto has said. Now, obviously, Beto said a lot of things, but so, I think polling, a lot of people will just reject polling outright as completely unreliable and useless, but it's one of the only measures of how people feel about, different policies that isn't just based off of anecdotes,
Right.
basically. And while it's not 100% reliable, as everyone knows, from, there are lots of, polling is a snapshot in time, and it's one that relies on the skill of the pollster to, filter the results with, especially when you're talking about elections. They might poll a certain number of people, but then they have to screen who they believe is going to actually show up at and vote, because that's different from who, all adults or all registered voters that aren't all going to show up to vote in an election. So what they think is not really what matters. It's what the people who are going to vote think that matters,
right,
in the end. And so that's another layer of subjectivity that's based on, hopefully, if you're a good pollster, experience and evidence will give you a likely voter filter that's actually fairly accurate. And then, obviously so polling is fairly complicated, as you can see from what we've been talking about here.
right.
But I think it is still valuable and useful in at least giving you some sense of what's going on beyond just anecdotes.